Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Today we're going to continue to see the marriage between Bertie and Elizabeth, and now we'll see what happened after Edward abdicated, the birth of Margaret. Before we get into all the abdication chaos, we need to see how everyone reacted to the birth of Princess Margaret. Elizabeth and Bertie decided the baby should be born at Glamis Castle. Elizabeth and Princess Elizabeth took an overnight train in mid-July, and Bertie arrived there a little bit later. She was due to have the baby between August the 6th through August the 12th. So Bertie spent his time shooting with Claude Strathmore and his brother-in-law David. And Bertie wrote to his mother and told her of his anxiety, saying, "I find I get very nervous and anxious about everything. I know it is unnecessary and silly, but I can't help it." So Elizabeth, she was tired of waiting for the baby to arrive, and her two obstetricians, Sir Henry Simpson and Fran Nina Reynolds, moved into the castle to be ready when needed. So they were being cautious, too, about the fear that the royal baby might be switched. So Bertie arranged for accommodations at Airlie Castle, 8 miles from Glamis, for 2 government overseers, the Labour Party Home Secretary John Rober Clines and his secretary Harry Boyd. And the Duke had a special telephone line installed between the castles. He also had a motorcycle and dispatch riders placed at Glamis in case the wires broke down. So Elizabeth went through 6 hours of labor on Thursday, August 21st, 1930, and at 9:22, the baby was born. She was 6 pounds and 3 ounces. Lilibet was allowed in the nursery the next day, and they asked her to keep quiet, and she did as she was told. So the Scottish people showed their happiness that night. Thousands of villagers gathered in Glamis, and they were followed by kilted bagpipers to the top of Honeyear's Hill, and they lit a 30-foot-high bonfire. The people cheered, joined hands, and danced around the bonfire. The bagpipers played Highland Lassie and the Duke of York's Welcome, and that was composed at her birth. Elizabeth watched from her room at the castle, and the glow of the fire could be seen in 6 counties, so that's how big it was. Queen Mary was said to be disappointed the baby wasn't a boy. King George V surprisingly said he was glad it was a girl. He said one could play longer with girls than with boys, and the parents were young, and they had plenty of time to have a son. September the 6th, Elizabeth told the Queen they decided to name the baby Margaret Rose instead of Margaret Anne, because Bertie didn't like the name Anne. So Margaret was the family name in the Strathmore family for 500 years, and the name Rose was for the Duchess's sister, who was one of the first visitors to see the baby. Elizabeth stayed in bed for 2 weeks after the birth of the baby, and the family returned to London in early October. When Margaret was christened, she was dressed in the same vintage christening robe Lilibet had worn. Elizabeth wrote, "She's got large blue eyes and a will of iron." Elizabeth also said, "As long as she can disguise her will and use her eyes, then all will be well." So now we come to the abdication. Before David stepped away from the throne, his father George V instinctively knew that David wasn't going to be a good king. He at one time told a long-standing royal circle person, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie, Lilibet, and the throne." So Bertie talked to David about abdication that day, and he couldn't believe that David was excited about it. And David was thinking that he could maybe keep his role as king and leave it to the people and subjects to decide what should be done. But this idea was rejected by the cabinet. And Bertie saw him a second time that night. In the presence of Bertie and his sister Mary, David made the dreadful announcement to his mother that he could not live alone as king and must marry Wallace. And Bertie wrote to his mother, "I feel so terribly sad for you, darling Mama. I am feeling very overwrought as to what may befall me. But with your help, I know I shall be able to carry on." So Bertie tried to reach the king repeatedly throughout the weekend by phone. He couldn't get him, but Stanley Baldwin, the prime minister, kept Bertie in the loop, according to the book George VI and Elizabeth. 3 or 4 times on the day before the abdication, Bertie disguised himself and went to 10 Downing Street. So David went into solitude, and talking to him was impossible. Elizabeth came down with the flu for 2 weeks. It was said in the book that for a woman robust enough to live for over 100 years, Elizabeth had severe respiratory ailments, and it began in her teens, and she would also take to her bed in stressful moments. And she wrote in a letter that the strain is terrific, and every day lasts a week. On Monday, December 7th, David took Bertie's call. and Bertie went to see David. Bertie was pacing up and down in the room, and he told Bertie he decided to go. And then Bertie vowed to help his brother. Prince George went to see David, and he said he was trying by every means in his power to persuade the king to stay, but no one could sway his decision. The king held a stag party for 8 in the dining room at the fort where he stayed. His brothers Bertie and George were there, as well as the Prime Minister, Monckton, and 3 other advisors. The Prime Minister tried one more time to change the mind of the king, but he couldn't change his mind. So Bertie was astonished that David was the life and soul of the party, and he was wearing a white kilt, and he held good conversations. Later, after seeing the papers of abdication, Bertie said that he broke down and cried like a child. Queen Mary remembered the whole abdication and how Bertie was miserable. She said, "He sobbed on my shoulder for a whole hour there upon the sofa." And Elizabeth wrote from her bed to Queen Mary that she had great faith in Bertie. "He sees very straight." When Bertie went through London, he had large crowds around his car, and they sang "God Save the King," and "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow," and chants of "We Want the King," and Bertie felt overwhelmed. The Duke told Bertie that he would find the king job not difficult at all. He told him that Bertie had overcome the slight hesitation in speech. So David gave his farewell speech at 10 o'clock, and the family listened together at Royal Lodge. Queen Mary thought it was a good and dignified one, and David joined them at 10:30 to say what the Queen said was a dreadful goodbye. She said it was too pathetic for words. Princess Mary sobbed hysterically, and the former king told her, "For God's sakes, don't go on like that, Mary. You're making it more difficult for us all." And the Queen and Princess Mary left first, and the former king bowed to his mother. And Bertie and David stayed for another hour together. They talked about all the subjects except for the king topic, and they had a toast before midnight, and Bertie walked with David to the door, and David bowed and kissed Bertie's hand. He told Bertie, "Thank you, sir, for all your kindness to me, and God bless you, sir. I hope you will be happier than your predecessor." So Elizabeth at this time still had a great affection for David, but that would change later. But at this time she wrote David a letter, and she apologized that her illness prevented her from going to the Royal Lodge for the farewell. She said, "As I wanted so much to see you before you go and say God bless you from my heart. We are all overcome with misery and can only pray that you will find happiness in your new life." She said she thought of the old days and how he helped them in the first years of their marriage. "I shall always mention you in my prayers and bless you." And she signed it Elizabeth. I will end the video here. All was well at first with the birth of their daughters, but then David decided to throw a monkey wrench into the lives of Bertie and Elizabeth by saying he didn't want to be king because he couldn't have Wallace Simpson by his side. So he left Bertie to step into the king role. It was a role Bertie never wanted, but once he became the king, he surely would have made his father, George V, very proud. And we'll see all that in the next video. And I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.